Now it's time for Behind the Headlines with a closer look at some of today's stories. Just a day after the UK began rolling out the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the Financial Times reports on British regulators issuing allergy warnings. With just under 3 weeks to go until the Brexit deadline, we'll take a look at the Brussels Times as Boris Johnson meets Ursula von der Leyen for last-minute talks. World Soccer Talk says the unprecedented walkout of PSG and Başakşehir players over an alleged racist comment by an official has deepened the row over racism in football. And Japan is turning to artificial intelligence in hopes of boosting its birth rate. We'll take a look at the Japan Times. With me to review all of those stories are French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and author and activist Yasmin Abdel-Majid. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for being with us on Behind the Headlines today. So yesterday, the first patients in the world got vaccinated against coronavirus here in the UK. But today, Nabila, we're hearing that 2 people didn't react well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the world has been waiting months for the coronavirus vaccine. And here we are waiting for our jabs. But there are also negative stories like this around. And just as we are prepared, to end horrors like lockdown and living in constant fear of this terrible disease, we hear of 2 British national health workers having an allergic reaction to a vaccine. And I'm afraid this is entirely predictable. No news is good news, and even wonderful scientific breakthroughs come with warnings. And I'm sure it was exactly the same when penicillin was discovered or when the first headache pills were invented. And, medical treatments is never 100% predictable, and it can have very different effects on different people. And sometimes there are negative aspects to it. And in this case, the 2 NHS workers are now absolutely fine. And I doubt that there is any way that it is going to be a slow down in the distribution because of that.
And Yasmin, it is, of course, important to note that this kind of thing is very, very common with all vaccines.
Yes, exactly right. And as Nabila said, it's not unexpected. I think it's very predictable. But the issue is, of course, the stories that it creates and how it feeds into what is known as vaccine hesitancy. And unfortunately, it can be twisted by those who already think that or already cite concerns about the speed of the vaccine's development and so on as a reason to perhaps not take the vaccine. So I think there's a real challenge. The scientists' challenge was to develop the vaccine, and they've done their part. But the real challenge now is a much more political and social one: is how do you get entire populations that may already be hesitant, that may already be a little uncertain as to how the vaccine will be rolled out, etc. When they hear stories like this, even if it's just a very predictable, very expected allergic reaction, how do you encourage people to continue taking the vaccine despite things like this, which are expected?
Absolutely. And Nabila, as Yasmin refers to there, the important thing is that people don't get put off by this and that as many people are as vaccinated as possible.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the symptoms can be a bit alarming. We heard of skin rashes and breathlessness, and there might have been a drop in blood pressure as well. But I don't think that any of this is particularly unusual when the body is subjected to something new. And there is every chance that a second shot of the vaccination might not have adverse effects at all. And I think, as Yasmin said, the important thing is that a vaccination program is already on the way in Britain, and it will soon be around the world too.
And Yasmin, we should also say that this is only one of many potential vaccines in the pipeline.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because it's not like a typical case where there's only one company working. There are a number of different companies. We've heard about the Pfizer, we've heard about AstraZeneca, we've heard about Moderna. But also, I think what's interesting is that they all have different applications they all have different storage mechanisms. They all perhaps may be operating in different ways. And I think what will be interesting and challenging is how do you encourage trust and develop trust within communities in order to say, well, actually, all of these vaccines are just as good as each other, and you shouldn't just wait for one over the other one, and so on. So I think it's definitely an unprecedented challenge, and it'll be interesting to see how countries tackle it.
OK, well, let's talk about another unprecedented challenge, which is Brexit. And the latest in this very long-running saga is that Boris Johnson's in Brussels right now for what's being described as a last-ditch attempt to reach a deal. So, Nabila, do you think all this sort of late-stage negotiation is a power play by the EU, which is something that Mr. Johnson has seemed to suggest?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I think that the entire Brexit process has been notoriously shambolic over the past 4 years, and this kind of the kind of schoolboy language we heard from Boris Johnson talking about the EU attempting to punish the UK is typical of the kind of discourse that has been flying about, frankly, and the idea that there will be grown-ups hoping that an entire country, one filled with all kinds of different people, can actually be punished by an entire continent for Brexit, I think is quite ridiculous. A punished Brexit doesn't help anybody, least of all the EU, which will still be next door to the UK and which will still rely on Britain massively. Britain will not stop being a hugely powerful, influential country, and the EU won't stop being an equally powerful trading bloc right next door. My view is that Brexit is really just about Britain redefining its relationship with the EU. And there is no possibility, actually, of leaving. Britain is massively linked to the European continent, and it needs to work out new names for old arrangements.
But we have had some strong words from President Macron, haven't we? Including that he said if there is no deal, that Britain will be back negotiating again next year. So do you think that France is underestimating Britain, or maybe Britain is overestimating its importance? What do you think, Yasmin?
Gosh, isn't this the longest running story ever? And part of me, as somebody who lives in Britain, is thinking, oh, this will be over by, the 31st of December, when we know that this will continue really probably for the rest of our lives, or at least for another decade or so. I think that, yes, there's lots of saber rattling. Yes, there's lots of strong words, but we've seen saber rattling and strong words throughout this since the referendum, really, and even before that. And as Nabila says, Britain's not literally moving its geography. Like, it cannot deny the fact that it is part of the European continent, that it's going to have huge trade with the rest of Europe and the EU continuously. And I also think it's not only about redefining its relationship with Europe, but it's about redefining its relationship with who it is in the global context, right? This is the first time. It's fascinating to think this might be the first time where British citizens don't have freedom of movement, quote unquote, because they had, the empire, and then they shifted to the European Union, and they're used to being able to move around the world in a way that they please because of their passports and so on. So I do think that, yes, there are lots of strong words, but what's probably who knows really what will come out of the dinner that happens tonight. And I think the markets are still sort of counting on a deal, and people are basically sort of saying there's probably going to be something that gets through by the end of the month. But I do think that there is no the incentive is not actually about how good the deal is, because the vote was not about whether or not we'll have a good deal. It is about who Britain is. And that's got a long way to go to sort out.
Well, as you say, a very long-running story with plenty of twists and turns likely still in front of us. I want to move on to our third story, which is about two football teams walking off the field over an alleged racist incident. So, Nabila, do you think the players did the right thing?
Well, certainly the UEFA has opened a disciplinary proceeding into Tuesday's Champions League match between Paris Saint-Germain and Istanbul Basaksehir when players walked off during a match after the Turkish club accused a match official of racism. European football's governing body it said on Wednesday that it had appointed an ethics and disciplinary inspector to conduct a disciplinary investigation regarding the incident. On the surface, this sounds this sounds like very good news because it is an example of footballers taking positive action against racism rather than simply virtue signaling with signs and indeed slogans. And two sets of players from France and the Turkey sides walked off the pitch, and everyone from world leaders and to other players rightly condemned what looked like a very serious example of casual racism. And the fact that it was a casual racism rather than something stronger is very important because it hints towards zero tolerance. And this wasn't an example of an official coming out with racist violence or unspeakable language. It was an example of someone insulting a human being using racial language. Now, some are arguing that it wasn't racist at all and all the official was doing was referring to someone's color to identify him, but there are very strong grounds for arguing that this is exactly what casual racism amounts to. And I think whatever the case, an investigation is underway, and we should be able to see exactly what went on and make up our own minds.
Well, Yasmin, I wonder, though, given the reaction of the players, is this the moment where change can happen? We're seeing the growing importance of the Black Lives Matter movement. Is it the moment for football to make that big change and move forward?
Football has been trying for some time now to challenge racism, and I think it's a particularly interesting sport to talk about racism because it's a very global sport where there are quite a lot of black players, but also a lot of black players that play for European teams in Europe and in European countries. And so I think what's really interesting about this case is that it's a moment of, as Nabila says, casual racism, interpersonal racism. What I'm personally more interested in is, can this be a moment where the players use their heft and their weight to push for even more challenging conversations within the sport of football around, let's look at the systemic and the institutional racism, because the sport is essentially one where most of the managers are white, most of the owners of the teams are white. The dynamics where the power is, I mean, ultimately, a lot of the time people are buying and selling the players in a way that when you kind of take a step back and you look at it and you're like, all of these mostly white owners and managers are buying and selling quite a lot of black and brown players. Like, these are dynamics that aren't just about whether somebody calls another person by a racial slur, but that is the sort of basis for a much broader and much more systemically racist sport.
Interesting stuff. Well, let's move on to our final story, which is that Japan is using artificial intelligence to help matchmake people. Nabila, how is this supposed to work?
Well, love is famously blind, and nobody has ever really worked out, the best way of matching lonely hearts. So at least there is now a scientific element to it. And some will say this is a good thing because it's a rational system that ensures people of the right intelligence getting together and, I presume, producing super intelligent children too. The problem is that intelligence has never anything to do with romance, or indeed true romance. And as we know from millions of songs, films, and books on the subjects, and all the best romances tend to involve, in fact, a lot of irrationality and indeed madness. And if you take foolishness out of the equation, then it becomes a bit soulless and indeed uninspiring. And if people know they've just been brought together by an algorithm, then there's a very good chance that there won't be any kind of romantic sparkle at all.
Well, as you say, an algorithm doesn't sound very romantic, does it? I wonder, Yasmin, though, do you think it can work? A computer has no emotional intelligence, but maybe they could make a good match.
I don't know. I think anyone that spent time on dating apps will tell you about the soulless nature of going of a machine or an equation essentially facilitating what's romance. I mean, what's interesting, there's a couple of interesting things about this. Number one, part of the reason that Japan has decided to go about this is because their fertility rate is going down. And usually countries respond to that by opening up immigration policies. But this is about actually, rather than having an immigration policy, we're going to try to get the people that already live here to procreate. And rather than thinking about why aren't people procreating, the solution is to let's use an equation, a technical solution to somehow get people to procreate more. And as a woman who may or may not want to procreate, what does that mean? That there's an expectation from the state to somehow have more children? I think that like people getting together is one thing, but also the expectation that you should have babies because that's the thing to do for the state is a whole other thing.
Well, yes. I mean, as you say, we're joking about this, but a falling birth rate is pretty serious, Nabila, and something that Japan has to deal with in whatever way they think best.
Yes, indeed. I think, as Jasmine just said, it sounds like a societal project, and indeed more like a state policy rather than solving problems such as loneliness or indeed compatibility between people or indeed a true romance. It's a very a serious policy, in fact, backed by scientific support in order to increase the birth rate in Japan. And this has all to do with, I suspect, sustaining productivity and sustaining, a welfare state going on, young generations looking after older generations. So it's a vast societal project aimed at keeping Japan afloat.
Well, let's hope romance isn't dead yet. Nabila Ramdani and Yasmin Abdelmajid, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this edition of Behind the Headlines.